Oh, hey everybody, welcome back. I was just working some FT8 on 20 meters and having a lot of fun with it. Not long ago, I had the opportunity to attend the Microhams Digital Conference in Redmond, Washington. And Joe Taylor, one of the authors of FT8, did a presentation there. And I've got the video. So while I work some more stations, why don't you sit back and enjoy Dr. Taylor's talk.
So I have to say, I asked him for a bio when we first had some conversations, and he said, well, you can put together something off of the page, and it was his Nobel laureate page. And I was thinking, well, that's the first time that's ever happened. People often send me to some, Facebook thing or something, right? But not that. So Nobel laureate Joe Taylor, K1JT, first obtained his amateur radio license as a teenager, which led him to the field of radio astronomy. He is well known in the field of amateur weak signal communication. In 2010, he used the Arecibo radio telescope to conduct moon bounce with amateurs around the world using voice, Morse code, and digital communications. Joe Taylor shared the 1993 Nobel Prize in Physics for 30 years of observations of a binary pulsar that demonstrated the existence of gravitational radiation in the amount and with the properties first predicted by Albert Einstein. Joe's topic today is working the world with WSJT-X. That is what that says. Excellent. A software package and a protocol suite that utilizes computer-generated messages and radio transceivers to communicate over long distance. WSJT is useful for passing short messages via non-traditional radio communication methods such as moon bounce, meteor scatter, and other low signal-to-noise radio paths. It is useful for extremely long-distance contacts using very low power. So please welcome Dr. Joe Taylor.
Thank you, Scott, and it's great to be here with you, everybody. Sorry my voice is a little bit off normal because of a cold, but I'm doing fine and really delighted to be with you. A good place to start this talk might be to emphasize the ways in which the kinds of digital communication I'll be talking about are different from the ones we've been hearing about this morning. In particular, we're at the opposite end of a spectrum in a sense, because the weak signal communication modes that I'll be talking about and that are implemented in this software program, WSJT-X, are made specifically for minimal contact, for making minimal contacts where you exchange call signs and signal reports and maybe a grid locator and not much else, as opposed to arbitrary information that you can exchange with digital voice or packet radio and so forth. So we're talking about cases where the signaling rate may be very much slower. The necessary signal-to-noise ratios are definitely very much lower. And in fact, the design goals of the various different modes implemented in WSJT-X and its forerunner program, which was simply called WSJT, are mainly VHF-oriented and VHF-DXing. In particular, moon bounce and meteor scatter were two of the modes that motivated the development work that was done on these modes originally. So with that as a background, let's go ahead and let's see, the clicker here seems to work. Okay, so we're talking about a piece of that seemed to disappear, but I'm not sure why. The slide is mostly there, but there's that big blank area wasn't blank before. So starting from the top, I was sort of going through a history here of the development of these modes. They started out with a program that I called WSJT. The WS stood for weak signal. JT, of course, is just my call sign as well as my initials. And that started in 2001. The work started in 2001, where I was particularly interested in making something that would work well for meteor scatter on the VHF band, 6 and 2 meters in particular, but it also works a little bit higher in frequency. And moon bounce, which I was interested in doing. I had always been interested in doing it, and from my original ham radio time as a teenager back in the 1950s, when I wasn't able to achieve it, and then getting back into active ham radio 35 years later or so, near the turn of the century. I wanted to address that again. The second blank area on this slide referred to a program that I called MAP 65, which was specifically for doing moon bounce on the 2 meter band particularly, but it's since then been used at higher frequencies as well. Basically, it's sort of the digital analog of using CW skimmer. Instead of decoding one signal that you tune to, it decodes a whole region of the band and decodes all the signals in there. And so you can find out, particularly, for example, during the annual ARRL EME contest, you can monitor the whole portion of the 2 meter band where the EME guys are working each other, and you can see who's calling CQ and who's ripe for a contact to add to your log. So that program implemented a number of new techniques, in particular multi-decoding like CW skimmer. You look at a whole lot of different signals, and adaptive polarization, because the linear polarization of signals that have been reflected from the moon and come back to the Earth through the Earth's ionosphere both ways have got their planes of polarization rotated by the Faraday rotation in the ionosphere, a magneto-ionic medium where you've got both ionized medium and a magnetic field. And that means that basically the angle at which linearly polarized signals will be received on Earth is arbitrary. You can't predict it from one hour to the next. It varies slowly as the line of sight through the ionosphere changes and the total amount of rotation changes. Then more recently, around 2008, the signal processing program known as WSPR, WSPR, turned out to be a nice acronym, and the letters stood for Weak Signal Propagation Reporter. And it in fact does whisper, because most people use it with very low power, perhaps typical QRP power of 5 watts or so, but maybe only milliwatts. And with whisper signals, you can detect other signals and have yours detected or anywhere in the world, typically with only a few milliwatts and a compromised antenna. It's fascinating that it works, but it does. And most recently, the program WSJT-X, which is mainly what I'm talking about today, brings together a lot of these concepts into one program. So this one is used at basically on all bands, many different modes, all the way from the new bands down below the broadcast band up to SHF bands, 10 and even 24 gigahertz. Moon bounce are being done typically with this program now. For various reasons, not least of which is the advent of the most recently added new mode in these programs, which is known as FT8. We've got now thousands of users worldwide. FT8 somehow caught the fancy of lots of users on the HF bands, and there are something like 15,000 users in any given week recently. Which was a big surprise to us. You know, we weren't aiming for that kind of thing. We had a particular goal in mind when designing that mode. It had to do with working people on 6 meters during the summer sporadic E season when you get multiple hops, but typically the signals are weak, and digitizing them makes it easier to dig them out of the noise. So I've been already using some jargon which may not be familiar to everybody here, and I just want to define a few terms to be sure we're all on the same page. When I'm talking about modes, I'm talking about a particular signaling protocol and signaling method and a protocol. You could call CW a mode, and PSK31 is certainly a popular digital mode, but the other ones that I'm talking about are ones that where the letters and numbers there strung out are the ones implemented in this program WSJT-X. They are all designed for making this minimal communication where you work somebody and put them in your log. You can add them to your DXCC total or your contest total, whatever it is, but you don't chew the rag. You don't exchange very much information beyond call signs, signal reports, locations, and so forth. So within these protocols, how do we define what makes one of them different from another one? Well, we're using different coding schemes, including all these modes, by the way, have FEC, forward error correction, built into them. They basically are very reliable. When you decode a message, it's error-free, or else the program simply gives you nothing. So you don't miscopy call signs or get a locator wrong and so forth. But the different modes use different forms of modulation. They use different symbol rates, different block sizes, and I'll go through a little bit of that as background, although the primary purpose of this talk was not to sort of give a designer's overview of the way the modes were designed and implemented. When I talk about codes, I'm mostly going to be talking about the error correcting codes built into each of these protocols. Broadly speaking, by a code we mean how some kind of symbols are going to represent information. And there are character by character modes that are widely used in ham radio, where you transmit one character at a time and build up words or numbers or whatever they are. Morse code is certainly an example, Bodo is another, ASCII, and so forth. But the modes that we're going to be discussing here are all modes that are block structured. They have fixed length messages, a certain number of digital bits, and within that, the forward error correction scheme is an integral part. And we use various different FEC codes, partly because this whole thing was a learning exercise for me. I was looking for something new to play with and decided I wanted to learn communication theory. And so I've been experimenting with Reed-Solomon codes, convolutional codes, turbo codes, linear, low-density parity check codes, LDPC, that's what that stands for. The QRA, or Query Repeat Accumulate codes, most recently. All very fascinating, all fairly mathematical and important to information theory or communication theory these days. So let me say a few things about why it is that all these different modes got built into WSJT and WSJT-X. The X stood for experimental or extended or something like that when we brought that. I couldn't think of a better name, I guess, for the program. We could almost drop the X recently because it is the only program that people are using widely. I was aiming at making these minimal contacts between ham A and ham B work well under a variety of different propagation conditions. So certainly at MF and HF frequencies, we've got ground wave, we've got sky wave. As you go up in frequency, tropospheric scatter becomes an important possibility. When you're working on 2 meters out beyond 100 miles or so, you're getting into the troposcatter region. We were interested in multi-hop sporadic E. We were interested in moon bounce. That takes place almost exclusively on the VHF and UHF bands and up into the microwave bands. And certainly meteor scatter, aircraft scatter, ionospheric scatter, all of those things were interesting. And one of the ways in which these various modes are different is that the ones coded here in blue are ones that typically have fairly slow QSB or fading, and the depth of fading is relatively shallow. Whereas meteor scatter, for example, the depth is infinite, if you like. There's no signal there at all most of the time. And then for a brief instant, when there's a meteor shooting over somewhere in between station A and station B, you get a reflected or scattered signal which rises above the noise. And so very different techniques need to be used to exchange useful information in those brief amounts of time. Aircraft scatter has been becoming a much more interesting form of communication these days. For example, when you're working in a VHF, UHF contest and want to work guys out of the current local area, if you're on a path with a lot of overflying aircraft, you get good signals reflected from them, but only for a few seconds at a time. And if you can exchange the necessary contest information or whatever else it is that you're doing in those few seconds, you can work out to many hundreds of miles instead of just a fairly local region. So there you get the basic idea. So here are the various modes broken into two columns. Again, the blue ones are the ones that are particularly useful in slow fading conditions, and the scatter modes require different design goals in the protocols to make them work well. MSK 144 is currently the favorite mode for doing meteor scatter. There are some fast modes associated with the mode called JT9. In particular, JT9 with letters E through H after it. There are JT9 A, B, C, D have different spacings between the tones and different rates at which the tones are sent and so forth. On the right-hand side, the blue modes are all the slow ones. The one at the top, FT8, is the one that has been so extremely popular recently, and I'll talk in detail about that one. Whisper is down at the bottom. Whisper is different from all of these other modes in that it is not built to make two-way contact between stations. It's rather a sort of a quasi-beacon mode, or if you like, a one-way mode where you transmit now and then and receive most of the time and receive other stations, and reception reports are sent to a central database maintained by a different group, not by me, but at which you can basically see what paths are open worldwide. And that mode has been quite popular now for almost 10 years. By the way, before I go on into greater detail on any of these things, let's see a show of hands on people who have actually used WSJTX. Okay, so it's a fair few, probably less than half. And what about Whisper? Any Whisperers in here? Okay, some of those as well. Great. So just a few more words about why so many different modes. Again, it's because of different propagation types which have different characteristics which require different optimization schemes for making the protocol work most effectively. That means that the actual details of the code design and the optimization of various parameters that go into the protocol are different depending upon such things as the fading rate, the fading depth, the amount of Doppler spread on the signals. You send out a pure carrier, what gets received at the far end has got a little bit of wobble in the frequency caused by the nature of the propagation mechanism. And the receiver, for optimum decoding reliability, has to be able to allow for that, and so forth. Also, what was important under the why so many modes column is, again, the fact that I, and more recently we, speaking of the larger group which is now contributing to the development of this software, are people who are not necessarily trained experts in communication theory or DSP or any of the rest of it. We're learning as we go, and we try things and they work pretty well, and we make it part of the program and people use it, but then we find something that works even better. And so that's one of the other reasons why there are so many different modes. I might also mention, by the way, that as you might guess by my background, I don't necessarily approach these things quite the same way that a communications engineer would do. I tend to approach it from first principles as a physicist, and that means that I reinvent a lot of stuff that was already known by people in the communication field. And I do spend time in my university's engineering library reading the literature, but usually it's after I've already done whatever it was I was going to do. Then I find out, oh, well, they already knew that. Okay, so about mode design and the various different parameters that you might tune when you're doing this. All of these different modes use a block message structure, a fixed length block, which you try to communicate from A to B with no errors. Okay? That means that we typically use, the first thing that we typically do, starting with a human readable message that the transmitting operator wants to send to the other guy, you do compression. You compress that to the minimum number of bits that can be sort of a lossless form of compression so that it can be decompressed at the other end back into the original message. So there's that kind of thing is referred to by communications engineers as source encoding. You take the source message and you encode it into the minimum number of bits. And then you add error control information. That's redundancy. That's forward error correction. And there are lots of different code types that are known. And we started out using ones that have been known for decades, like the Reed-Solomon code and various different convolutional codes. Most recently, we've been actually using things which are at the current forefront of the development of these kinds of things, including, for example, these low-density parity check codes, a very powerful way of encoding forward error correction information, which has been known since back around 1960-ish. On paper, but which was completely impractical until we had very fast computers to do the decoding at the other end. But it's perfectly practical today, and we use it all the time. The information throughput rate has got to be part of the design, and once you sort of settle on the things in the top part of this list, you then have to choose a modulation type, a rate at which you're going to key the modulation, whether it's frequency shift keying or whatever, that means a signal rate, and those things together are going to turn out to define the occupied bandwidth of the signal. And in almost all cases, I think, the occupied bandwidths of the signals I'll be talking about are very small compared to the ones that we've been talking about earlier today. So we're not talking about taking many kilohertz of bandpass, it's typically a few hertz. FT8 signals are 50 hertz wide, and you can that means you can jam a whole lot of them into the passband of a typical single sideband transceiver, and you'll see more examples of that. One of them was on my title slide where you saw about a 2 kilohertz slice of spectrum with 50 or so signals in it, all of which could be decoded independently. In all these cases, we're going to need an accurate synchronization method, synchronization between the timing of the frames of information and the individual symbols that make up the information in the frame. The receiver has got to resynchronize with the transmitter at the receiving end, and that's an important part of the process as well. Now, I mentioned already that we're talking about making minimal QSOs with very weak signals. We're going to try to optimize the ability of the decoder to dig down into the noise without making any errors in reproducing what was transmitted at the other end. And so, since we're interested primarily in one task, making minimal contacts, exchanging maybe a signal report and a grid locator and your call signs, and not much else. So we can structure the messages in such a way that we will require the minimum number of bits to do that. And a typical contact sequence that I show here, blue being one station that called CQ and red being the station that answered him or her, that's the basic scheme underlying the communication information in all of these weak signal modes. So it turns out that we can actually make the message packet as small as less than 100 bits. In fact, we ended up settling on 72 bits as the basic block of information. That is the same length as the header, the link connection header code that we heard about first thing this morning. This is the whole message. Including the FEC and everything else. That's built into, sorry, it's not including the FEC. It's the user information block is 72 bits. We then expand that so that the actual number of bits that are sent over the channel are somewhat larger, maybe 2 or 3 or even 5 times larger, but it's still a fairly small number of bits. And we do that in the following way. It turns out you can encode any standard amateur call sign into 28 bits. They all have a number somewhere. And before that will be a prefix, which can be 2 characters, at least one of which has to be a letter. And then after the number, one of these might be a letter like 5B4 instead of KA1. But anyway, then there's a suffix with up to 3 letters. And anyway, it turns out putting all this together means that you can encode the whole call sign, basically any standard call signs anywhere in the world, into 28 bits. Of course, there are funny special event call signs and things that have funny numbers in them, and we don't do that. Okay, that doesn't fit into the 28-bit recipe here. If you want to send a locator, a 4-character locator, 2 letters and 2 numbers that tell you where a station is on the Earth to within 60 miles or so in latitude and longitude, depending a little bit on what the latitude is. Anyway, that turns out that takes another 15 bits. And we actually added one, that would make 71. We actually added 1 extra bit. If that extra bit is set to non-zero, to be a 1, then the first 71 bits are all reassigned as arbitrary free text. So you can send anything as long as it only takes 13 characters as part of a message in any of these modes as well. So if you want to build up some message like that, that takes 71 bits, and then you have the 1 extra bit that flagged that packet as being a free text message. And you can count these up. 1, 2, 3, 4, because the space is also a character. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, that just fits. But longer things don't work. Okay, let me talk specifically about a few of the features of the current program, WSJ-TX. It's available with installation packages for all standard platforms, Windows, Linux, OS X. You can compile it for any Linux-like system. The source code is all available, and even some compiling scripts are available to make that fairly easy. It does implement rig control for almost all modern radios. Anything built since, I don't know, since the turn of the century, say, has some kind of CAT control cable. The most recent ones even just have a nice USB connection. You connect that to the computer, and the computer can control frequency and band and various other things. All these modes do error-free communication for minimal QSOs, like I've already described. We do have really good decoders in here for all of these implemented modes. We get down very close to the famous Shannon limits, as close as are basically possible with the present state of the art. So that means that we're decoding things with signal-to-noise ratios on down to around into the -20s, depending on which mode we're talking about, where the signal and noise here that are being discussed are whatever the signal bandwidth is, and the noise bandwidth we've just taken to be fixed as 2.5 kilohertz, typically the bandwidth of a standard single sideband transceiver. So when we say the signal-to-noise ratio is less than 0 dB, it means that the signal is weaker than all that noise, but it doesn't mean that we're actually detecting things in a detection bandwidth at signal-to-noise ratios less than 1. We make the detection bandwidth as small as necessary to decode the signal that's being transmitted. And so, you know, we're not violating any physical principles here. The detection is actually done with software that gets down to bandwidths of only a few hertz, depending on what different mode is being involved. Among other things, we can actually do very accurate frequency calibrations of your radio, and there are macros for doing that built into the program. Basically, if you just use maybe a local big city standard broadcast station as a reference down at the very low end of the dial, and then use the various WW2V frequencies and maybe CHU, if you get those Canadian stations well, you can accurately map your radio's dial error over frequency. It always turns out to be a straight line with modern synthesized radios because it all depends on the accuracy of the master oscillator in the radio. So there's only one oscillator that is off a little bit. And once you calibrate that, you can get your radio to give you frequencies down that are accurate to the 1 hertz level, and that'll get you a gold star if you enter the ARRL frequency measuring contest, which is a lot of fun. It's a fun thing to do. Here, just in passing, are the signal-to-noise limits. Basically, the signal-to-noise ratio, again, defined with a 2.5 kilohertz reference bandwidth of these various different modes. Whisper is the most sensitive mode. It gets down into the minus 30 dB range, a little bit lower, and various others are shown here in between. Typical, a really good CW operator, like the guys that do moon bounce with CW, with the headphones on and concentrating and a lot of repetition and so forth, they can get down to signal-to-noise ratios around minus 15 dB on this scale. A signal that is weak but fairly easy to copy is more like 0 dB, and a single sideband signal, if you want to copy that, needs to be at least, say, 10 dB above the noise in 2.5 kilohertz bandwidth. Then you can probably make out what the guy's saying, but it's still a very weak signal. Anyway, these other modes all get well below that. So when you're making FT8 QSOs with stations around the world, and if you're getting signal reports for them in the negative 10 to negative 20 region, those are signals that you probably can't even hear. You'll hear a lot of tweedling if you turn up the audio on your radio while you're doing this, but that's mostly the strongest stations. If you're working the weaker ones, they probably, even if they were the only signal in the band, you wouldn't hear them very well, if at all. Okay, here's one fun slide just talking about the explosion of popularity of FT8 recently. The guy that runs the website associated with the Clublog group, where people upload their logs every now and then to the Clublog. And anyway, they mapped all the usage of different modes over calendar year 2017, last year. And FT8 was started around mid-year in July. So there was zero activity on FT8 before that time. And you can see the lines there for CW and phone and JT65, which is a popular mode, but is becoming much less popular because FT8 has sort of taken over from it. It's astonishing that at least near the end of the year, FT8 was making well over half of the calls that were being uploaded to Clublog. Pretty interesting. And was not what we were expecting when we released that capability in the program. Anyway, here's the program again. That was basically my title slide that you saw. So the upper colored vertical stripes, that's the waterfall that shows the signals. Those green horizontal lines are separated vertically by the fixed time period that is occupied by each FT8 transmission. All of these modes used timed sequences, so the transmission always takes exactly the same amount of time. For FT8, the transmit and receive sequences are 15 seconds long, 4 of them per minute. So those green lines are separated by 15 seconds. And in between those, you can see the various signals coming and going as people are working each other. Typically, again, the numbers across the top are frequencies in hertz. The receiver is tuned to 14074, the 20-meter frequency at which, by convention, people have been using this mode. You can use it anywhere, but that's where the group of typical users will be found. And the frequencies, so that's the dial frequency of your transceiver. You've got it set in upper sideband mode, and the frequencies across the top are then frequencies in hertz above that dial frequency. So you have basically a 2 kilohertz slice of spectrum there. I let the waterfall run up to a little over 3 kilohertz just to show that the concentration of all the signals are basically in one little subband, 2 kilohertz wide, or two and a little bit more. Because the decoded signals don't make mistakes in call signs, and because many of the decoded signals will include a 4-digit grid locator that tells where the station is, it's very easy to imagine how you could put all that information together at some central site, if it could be sent there, to produce a map of this guy working this guy and this station working somebody else over here. And that is done now routinely because WSJT sends all of its received decoded transmissions that include a locator to a central site called PSK Reporter. And you can bring that up on on your browser, and it basically shows you who's working who worldwide using the FT8 or any other mode. You can select the mode, you can select the band, you can select even a particular call sign. Maybe you only want to see who's decoding your own signals. Put your call sign in there and it'll tell you. That even if you haven't worked these people, if they are on and have their receiver running and they're connected to the internet, your connection will show up here on the map, and I'll show you some examples of this in a minute. The different colors correspond to different bands. Here I had selected all bands. As it happens, at the time this screenshot was made, which was just earlier this week, in the middle of the week, there were, what does it say, 2,638 FT8 monitors on. So worldwide, there were a lot of people listening. And if I put a signal on, I could quickly find out where I was being decoded. Let's just go through these a little bit, one band at a time. So here at a particular time were the people that were using FT8 on 160 meters last week. Obviously, 160 meters is a nighttime band. So over here, nighttime. Over here is daytime. A lot of Europeans on working each other. A few of them are working out into Japan or into Australia. That's good DX on 160 meters. Mostly we're talking about fairly, contacts within a continent anyway. Here's on 80 meters at the same time. Here's on 40 meters. 40 meters is a better DX band, so people are working a lot farther away. Even working across the Atlantic, even though it's daytime on our side at this point, we're still getting through this low part of the sunspot cycle. You can do that. Here's 30 meters, a lot more transatlantic stuff going on. Here's 20 meters. Now, of course, 20 meters is primarily a daytime band, so lots of that going on and lots of DX across the Atlantic. The Europeans have pretty much gone to bed at this point, and over here it's in the wee hours of the morning, so nobody's on. But you can sort of see what's still. And 20 meters that doesn't close immediately at sunset. You get a few more hours after dark, typically. Here's 17 meters. More and more now we're getting into the frequency range of daytime bands. A lot of north-south stuff going on now. Trans-equatorial propagation. Recently, the higher bands haven't been any good at all, but the day that I happened to do this, even 15 meters was wide open, particularly on north-south paths. Even 12 meters, and even 10 meters was wide open on north-south paths. So the Europeans and North Americans were all working into South America at this time. That was fun. So lots of people are on, lots of people are using FT8 and having a lot of fun with it. So let's carry on. One more slide here on, again, still looking at this website called PSK Reporter, which, by the way, has nothing explicitly to do with WSJTX, except that Phil Goldstone, the man who runs PSK Reporter and who wrote it, worked with us to make sure that the interface was proper and that we were sending him the information he needs to do it. Here I selected in the mode column over here at the upper right, selected MSK144 instead of FT8 for the mode. We selected 6 meters over here. Actually, I have all bands, but the only band on which people are using MSK144 routinely is 6 meters, so all these are red, which is the color for 6 meters. You will notice that apparently somebody is working into, what is that, Cyprus or Crete or something from the East Coast. Almost certainly that's spurious. I don't believe that. This guy, or some guy over here, is not using cat controls, so the program doesn't know which band he's on, and he switched bands after he last told the program which band he was on. So that's probably a 20-meter signal or something. And Phil Goldstone, the author of PSK Reporter, has worked up a scheme of identifying people that are misidentifying their bands, and you can check his list to see if that's believable or not. It almost certainly is not in this case. What in fact these people are doing, say within North America or within Europe, is they're working each other by meteor scatter. So those typical distances are what, 500 miles out to 1,000, 1,200 miles or so by meteor scatter. A few words about recent statistics of people using this mode FT8. I should mention, by the way, why are all these other modes JT something or other and this one is FT? Because originally it was just based on my call sign or my initials, but the co-author of this mode is Stephen Frank. That's where the F is. So it's Frank and Taylor FT8. That's I don't know, probably we should have had a better name, but that's what we came up with. Steve Frank is Kilo 9 Alpha November. He's a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. So another professor, if you like. Steve is not any more than I am an expert in this kind of coding and information theory, but he's in a department that has lots of people that do that. And so he actually has been sort of moving across subdisciplinary boundaries recently, talking to his colleagues and getting us a lot of good new ideas that we're putting into ham radio software. Typically, recently, the number of spots that are sent to PSK Reporter every hour is around 500,000. A bit more on a weekend and a bit less in the middle of the night in North America and Europe. But typically 500,000, I mean, typically 1 million per 2-hour slot, if you like. That's a lot of receptions. It's not too hard to see where they come from if there are more than 10,000 users and they're all receiving each other. But anyway, whenever they receive a message that has 2 call signs and a locator, that message is sent to a PSK Reporter, and that's where those maps come from. Typically, the number of active monitors on the air at any given time, over any hour, is a couple thousand, anywhere up to 4,000 or so. Again, there's a daily cycle, fewer when it's nighttime across the Atlantic, sort of, because the Europeans and the Americans have gone to bed. That's where the biggest activity is. But there's activity around the globe. The number of active transmitters in any hour may be a little higher, presumably because some people don't have their things configured to send their reception reports to a PSK Reporter. Interesting, among the various statistics that you can get from clicking on a little button on the bottom of the PSK Reporter screen is how many different DXCC entities have been decoded by a particular station over the last 24 hours. And typically the guy at the top of the list is well over 100, sometimes closer to 200. Certainly if you extend it over 7 days, which he also does, the top number of reception reports is a couple hundred DXCCs. It's very clear that if you care about it and would like to work 100 different countries with FT8, you can do it in a week with no trouble at all. And this, you don't need a kilowatt and a beam. You need 100 watts and a good dipole because the signals don't have to be strong. They can be well below what you would need for sideband or even CW. Okay, let me say a few things now about Whisper, the other of the most popular modes. Again, I'm emphasizing here things that are sort of have the widest interest and the largest number of users, even though the motivating philosophies underlying the development of all of these different modes typically were based on things that happen at 50 megahertz on up, because those were my particular interests at the time. Anyway, so the weak signal propagation reporter mode, pronounced Whisper. It's a low power, one-way mode. You don't make two-way contacts. That means we don't really even need 72 bits in the basic frame because we're only going to send one call sign, a locator to tell where that station is, and we added one additional field which is a number characterizing the transmitter power in dBm, decibels above 1 milliwatt. So 30 dBm is 1 watt, 37 dBm is 5 watts. When I run Whisper, I typically run 5 watts. So that's the message that I configure my Whisper setup to send. But anybody else would have a call sign, their locator, and their transmitter power. Some people have been doing this with transmitter powers of 0, 1 milliwatt, and they still get reports from around the world when conditions are right. Whisper, like the other modes here, is a very low bandwidth mode. It uses 4-tone frequency shift keying. So it's basically at any given instant, it's transmitting one of 4 different frequencies. They're separated by about 1.5 hertz, so the total bandwidth is 6 hertz. Again, you configure your software optionally to send your reception reports to a central database. In this case, it's called whispernet.org. And again, this allows the WhisperNet guys to have written software which shows signals starting at transmitter A and being received at receiver B, and you can plot that up on a world map. Typically, there are something like 1,500 Whisper stations participating on an average day. It's a little higher on the weekends and so forth, but people typically run their receivers all the time. In this country, we're not supposed to run unattended transmitters unless you're a beacon assigned and working in a beacon mode. So you're not really supposed to run Whisper with your transmitter transmitting on some of the time unless you're in control. Some people claim I'm in control even when I'm sleeping because I'm only right, nearby, whatever. I don't think we would say that in writing with the FCC present, but anyway, I think that's what some people do. There are almost 1 billion spots that have been sent to WhisperNet since 2008. Remarkable. But it's been popular. There's what the Whisper program itself looks like. Actually, it isn't. There is a separate standalone program called Whisper, which many people have used for many years, but currently Whisper is also built into WSJTX. So if you just switch modes in WSJTX, you get into Whisper, and it's basically the same. So again, you see the waterfall at the top, different signals. The Whisper transmissions, instead of being 15 seconds like for FT8 or 1 minute for almost all the other WSJTX modes, Whisper transmissions are 2 minutes long. And you configure your setup so that you transmit a certain percentage of the time and receive all the rest of the time. So a typical setup would say choose transmitting for 25% of the time or 20% of the time and receiving the rest of the time. That means in a given 10 minutes, you might transmit for 1 2-minute segment and listen for 4 2-minute segments to make up the total 10 minutes. It'll be something like that typically. And basically the receiver, the decoder simply displays who it is you've decoded, where they are, how far away that is. This is distance in kilometers, I think. And again, what their transmitter power was. You can see most people are running transmitter power around 1 watt, 30, 30, 30, 37, that's 5 watts. Here's a 23, so what's that, 20 milliwatts? It's pretty low. 200 milliwatts, I guess I'll make that. Anyway, you can see what the various ranges are. So here's the WhisperNet map. I have there, I think, selected all bands. So you're seeing worldwide activity, people whispering to each other. Each little location has a call sign associated with it that's flagged. You can, again, you can instruct the map to plot only those dealing with a particular call sign or call signs only from on particular bands, so forth and so on. And I guess I have a few more of those maps coming up. Here's a plot of the number of Whisper stations that are actively participating. going back to the time when the mode was first released in early 2008, just about 10 years ago now. And so we started from no usage at all, and currently we're up to around, 1,500 active users. The blue curve is the number of different calls heard, and the red curve is the number of actual stations sending reports to WhisperNet. So again, there's some people doing things here without sending in the reports. That's fine. You don't have to do that. Here's the number of whisper spots per day, which has also been ballooning recently. More people are finding out about it, deciding it's fun, building little systems that run only a few watts or a few milliwatts, maybe running it on a Raspberry Pi, which is easy to do, and that's a lot of fun. The different colors here represent different bands. So the light blue, for example, is 40 meters, a good DX band. The darker blue is 30 meters. Also not a bad band. The green near the top is 20 meters. Okay, here's a few more WhisperNet maps. Here's what you get when you put in a particular call sign. I put in my own there, so it's centered on central New Jersey, and you can see the stations that were copying me or I was copying them, connected by lines. If I clicked, zeroed in and clicked directly on K1JT, which is in here under a couple of others, if I click on that, it'll pop up a little balloon that'll have in it all the call signs of the stations that are receiving me and all the ones that I am receiving. That's often of interest to a user. Let me talk about a couple of very specific whisper-oriented games that people have played recently. A guy up in Toronto, VE3KCL, has made a solar-powered whisper system, which he flies in balloons. Here are a couple of party balloons, foil-type party balloons. He's used transmitters made by QRP Labs, Inc. You can order the boards. They're only $30 or something. The whole payload held up by these two party balloons weighs about 2 ounces, a little less than 2 ounces, 39 grams. So below the balloon is a quarter wavelength at 30 meters. So what's that? 7.5 meters of aluminum wire. Then there's the transmitter and other electronics, and then there's another quarter wavelength. This is a half-wave dipole, a half-wave vertical dipole with a transmitter in the middle and a GPS receiver, and boy, is this fun. So they launched this thing and it went around the world. Okay, it took off here in Toronto. It did this across the Atlantic and then all the way across Southern Europe across Northern Africa and Southern Asia. And then across North Korea probably, I don't know. Then across the Pacific, and here it is back past, they had huge celebrations when it went past the longitude of Toronto because it made a full 360 at that point. But it didn't come down yet, and in fact it kept going, and finally went down in this Atlantic somewhere, a little bit north of the equator, but just shy of Africa on the second time around.
They haven't got it back yet, have they?
Interesting. No, they didn't get it back. This was, I think, his balloon flight number 18 or something. He's done this quite a number of times. This was the first one that made it around the world. There was a second one as well. Interestingly, the red parts of the curve are actual tracking reports. Other people that just had their whisper systems running would send in that they'd received it, and they know where it is because the GPS receiver is currently updating the grid locator being sent out. The blue parts of the curve are nighttime, and this, of course, is solar powered. So when the sun goes down, the transmitter goes off the air pretty soon. The batteries only last a very short time. They couldn't carry very much in the way of battery backup in 2 ounces, right? So it's off the air here, but they do know the direction of the winds aloft. And so they can pretty much predict what it should do for the next few hours, and then they pick it up again. So basically, the blue lines are just connecting the dots, but with a little bit of extra information because they know the direction of the high. They also know the altitude. this thing is sending ordinary whisper signals on some of its transmissions and specially encoded JT9 signals on other parts of its transmissions. So they actually have two bands on which you can receive them. And when that information is put together, they get not only the location in latitude and longitude, but they get the altitude, they get the battery voltage, and a few other bits of important information. Temperature, I think they get, maybe speed, something like that. Google VE3 KCL balloon, and it'll all come up, and you can look at the more details. Here's another, yeah.
What typical altitude is that thing going at?
Around 10,000 meters. So it's the same height you fly at, but do keep in mind that a 777 hitting this thing wouldn't even know it had hit anything. There's basically no mass there. I don't think it's an aviation hazard. Here's another fun game played by a friend of mine, ZL1RS, who built an ocean floater with Whisper aboard. So here's his ocean floater. It's not tiny, and it certainly weighs more than a couple of grams. It's got a whip on it. It also runs in the 30-meter band. It has a transmitter about 200 milliwatts and a GPS receiver, and it's powered entirely by 18 D cells. So perfectly ordinary alkaline batteries are down here in the bottom part of this thing. It floats more or less upright, but of course it's being tossed around by ocean waves. Anyway, he got his friend who owns a sailboat to launch this, to take it from the North Island of New Zealand up toward Fiji. There's Fiji up near the top, and just let it go. So he dropped it in, and for the next year, this is what it did. Just following winds and waves and whatever. It ended up over here at just about the predicted time when the batteries should have failed. They did. It lasted, I think, 13 months. And it almost got itself back to Australia, but not at the same latitude. It had moved north quite a bit. Anyway, again, it was a lot of fun, and it had many people. Again, I received it myself on 30 meters many times in New Jersey. People around the world send in reports to WhisperNet, and WhisperNet, by the way, has a really good archiving system, so that if you want to know in the past who was receiving such and such a call over such and such a range of dates, you can get it from WhisperNet. You can download they basically just have a big disk file that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Did they recover it?
I don't know. I don't think they did. I think it would be pretty hard. They knew what grid locator it was in, but you know, that's 100 miles wide and 60 miles high. You're not going to find it very easily. Okay. Anyone else? Well, I've pretty much covered what I wanted to cover, I think. What is WSJTX good for? Well, it's a lot of fun for doing a lot of very different things. QRP DXing on the HF bands is its biggest following currently, and that's why there are 15,000 or more users. But and those people have lots of different interests. Certainly certificate hunting, the recent ARRL International Grid Chase, I think that idea came up at the League after FT8 was released, when they saw it was getting popular, because every FT8 contact exchanges a grid locator, so you might as well have some certificate associated with it, I guess. It wasn't my idea, but anyway, that's what they came up with. It's used a lot now for VHF contesting, where you can work a lot of extra grid multipliers by using the digital modes that get down into the noise. That's particularly important, more important than it might have been 20 or 30 years ago, because a lot of hams today don't do Morse. Period. Never learned it. But it's still good, really good, for meteor scatter and moon bounce, which are the things that it was originally designed for. But so you can see hams are very inventive. They have put our software tools to use, doing a wide range of things that either we didn't imagine, or maybe we imagined they might be of interest to some people, but didn't think would be the driving forces behind any of this stuff. But it does work very well for meteor scatter and moon bounce, and I'll just say a word or two about that. There's my own moon bounce antenna on 2 meters. On 2 meters, 140, I've got 4 Yagis. They're each 14 elements. And you can see that the EME antenna there is raised, pointing up at the moon. The other antennas on the same mast don't elevate, they just rotate. So they're looking horizontally while the EME antenna is pointed upwards. But I have worked all states on 2 meters. I've got 134 DXCCs, I think the last time I checked. So this does really work, and there are a lot of people that use it around the world. All those QSOs, essentially, almost all of them. I may have made a few hundred on CW, but most of them, thousands of QSOs, were made off the moon, reflecting, with JT65 as the digital mode. Interestingly, one of the most recently implemented modes in all of ours is this one called QRA64, QARY repeat accumulate mode with 64 different tones. It's been used a lot recently for moon bounce on the 10 gigahertz band and even the 24 gigahertz band, where you can actually do moon bounce with a little dish about this big. My friend Rex Moncur, VK7MO, likes to drive around in the Australian outback, going to different grid locators and giving his 10 gigahertz friends a contact off the moon to build up their grid locator total. They have a great amount of fun doing this. Rex is retired and he loves driving around in the outback. Let's see, that little system there, he's got I think it's a 2-foot dish, 70 centimeter dish on a tripod. I think it's just an ordinary camera tripod. He's running 50 watts at the feed. I don't think he can work another station the same size. The guys that he worked typically have a 2-meter dish, 6 feet or so across. Not a lot bigger, but somewhat bigger. We've been trying to get to a point where we can actually have 2 dishes that you could put in the back of your station wagon, have them work each other off the moon. We're not quite there. I think we're only shied by 3 dB or something, but we need a little bit more power. Currently, getting 100 watts on 10 gigahertz is not that easy, particularly not if you want it to be portable. You can buy surplus TWTs that'll get that much power, but those have complicated power supplies and they weigh a ton, and you don't want to put that in your car. So just a few final words. We do have a home page. If you Google WSJT, that's where you'll get. I suspect there are more than a few people in here who are good with software. If you're interested, all this is open source stuff. The user interface in WSJTX is written in C++ using the Qt or Qt framework, but the heavy-duty number crunching is actually done in Fortran because that's what I do well. but we also use Fortran. Don't laugh. Fortran is an ancient but honorable language. And it's whatever. We also, C or whatever we need, we use. The version control is done with Subversion. Maybe many people here probably know that. We have many contributors to the software now. A handful of ones who have done a lot of the programming in the current program, and even larger, many handfuls of ones who have made some contribution, and more such contributions are always welcome. So I think that's a good place for me to stop. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Any questions?
Yeah, why the numbers? I think maybe in all those cases, I should have said this, the number refers to the number of different tones used in the frequency shift keying. In all these cases, we are generating a constant envelope signal. That is, we change the frequency of the signal, and that means modulating the phase in some way, but we don't do any phase reversals or phase jumps. So the phase is continuous, and that means that we don't even need linear amplifiers, which is handy for a number of reasons. It means the signal doesn't widen out the way a PSK31 signal does if you overdrive the transmitter. These signals are basically all constant amplitude, so they don't do that. JT65 uses 64 tones for data and 1 tone for synchronization. That's where the funny number 65 comes from.
Dr. Taylor, I have a question from the chat room, from the live stream.
Okay.
Arnie would like to know, is EME possible on 2 meters with 100 watts and a reasonable size beam?
Is aiming. Oh,
EME.
EME.
Sorry,
yeah,
EME.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
apologies.
Yeah, definitely. 100 watts and a 8-element, 9-element, 10-element Yagi is sufficient to work some of the bigger stations on 2-meter EME. No trouble at all. 2 of those stations can probably work each other some of the time when the moon is in a colder part of the sky, but not necessarily any day of the year. There is a handful, maybe I know of 3, I think there's probably more like 6 or 8 now, single Yagi stations who have worked DXCC on 2 meters. So there are enough big stations around that you can work a lot of them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For EME, is it better to use UHF, 440, or 2 meters?
Yeah, 2 meters because there's a lot more activity, but 440 or 432 actually because the sky is colder and therefore you can do it with less power. So you make your choice. 432 is a great band for EME, although it's not as good as it used to be because of the number of oscillators and everything that we buy these days is filling up the band with birdies. That's also happening on 2 meters. But 2 meters has a huge amount of EME activity, and so I think it's the best band to start on.
Could you say just a word about the de-expedition mode, please?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so people who are already using FT8 know that there is coming a mode that we have called FT8 de-expedition mode. We made it basically at the request of the de-expedition that's going to Baker Island in June or July, which is one of the top 10 wanted DXCCs, and they're expecting to make many tens of thousands of QSOs. Ordinarily, they're primarily like DXpeditions are. They're going to be primarily sideband and CW, but they are going to have, they would have had a RTTY station as well. But they've decided, forget RTTY, we're going to do FT8. Cool. But we'd like it if FT8 could make QSOs faster than once every 2 minutes. 2 per minute, which is basically what you can do with standard FT8. So we scratched our heads for a while and decided, well, maybe we could make it go faster. We wanted to stay with the 15-second transmissions, but what else could we do? Well, among other things, we could make the DXCC, make the DX operator work more than 1 station at a time. So that's what we're doing. We're basically allowing them to add together up to 5 standard FT8 signals, separate them by 60 hertz on the band, so they'll be right after one another. So one of these signals may be calling CQ while another one is working somebody and another one is saying 73 to somebody. They're finished with it. Anyway, that's the basic operation. And we have showed more or less that it, in the lab, that it works up to something like 500 QSOs per hour. Well, that's a pretty good rate. I doubt that'll be achieved on the air in a pile-up with a lot of QRM and whatever, but we have built into it some schemes that we hope will minimize that. For example, the DX station will stay in the low end of the 0 to 4 kilohertz audio band. He'll stay right where he is, pretty much. If there's deliberate QRM, we have a way of evading that, but otherwise he's going to stay put. Everybody else has to call from 1,000 to 4,000 hertz. Okay, they don't go in the low end of the band. They stay up above 1,000. As soon as the DX operator decodes somebody and calls them, that station is going to then jump down below 1,000 hertz to send his final report. He's going to, okay, you called me, here's your report, and I'm in a clear part of the band now. And the DX station then says, thanks, got you, 73, you're in the log, and then he works somebody else. So basically, all of that is handled by the software, the automatic QSY into the low part of the band. Well, we've tested this on the air a number of times with a private group of a few dozen people, and it pretty much works, but we still got bugs in the program. We tested it once with a public request for other help, and that worked also, sort of, but it had bugs. So we're going to have another public test run coming up, And I hope within one or two more test runs, we'll get the rest of the bugs out of it and have it working. How it will actually work in a dog-eat-dog DXpedition pile-up, we'll find out, I guess. It'll be fun.
So as a follow-on to that question, one of the issues that I've noticed with FT8 is that people don't necessarily pay attention to what they're transmitting on top of. And are there plans to build some kind of avoidance into the upcoming versions?
So far, we've pretty much left that to the same kind of techniques we always use, and that is if you're not getting through, you move a little bit up or down and hope that you will. We've been very careful not to let the program make robotic contacts. It would be pretty easy to do that. We didn't want to. So you can't turn your thing on and let it run overnight and come back in the morning and find out who you worked. It doesn't do that. It doesn't do that by design. But as far as evading QRM, the only thing we've got in there that helps in that respect is that, and actually this is an important point for any of you who do any DSP kinds of stuff. Once a signal has been decoded, because it's a fixed 72-bit user message, if we've decoded it, we are 100% sure that it's right, and therefore we could re-encode it so we would have a waveform exactly equal to the waveform that was transmitted. Aside from maybe a little bit of frequency shift because the oscillators aren't exactly the same and a few other details like that, which we can basically peek up on in the software. We know exactly what was transmitted. So we can subtract that transmitted signal from the total that might have had 50 signals in it. And if there was another signal at the same frequency underneath the one that we decoded, then we can decode that one too. And if you look at what comes out of the stream of decoded signals, you will see they're in frequency order because we just sort of stepped through the total received passband in order. But it'll get up to 2,500 hertz or so, and then you'll see 3 or 4 extras at lower frequencies. Those are ones that were decoded on the second pass after the first, presumably stronger signal was already subtracted. We pioneered that with JT65 when that was the most popular mode. It worked very well there, and then so we've done it also in FT8. It's also done in Whisper now. So the decoders make multiple passes, subtracting out each decoded signal after it's decoded.
Is there been any effort to adapt this for use in PACTOR type situations, such as like a better version of HF communication?
The simple answer is no. It certainly could be done. I don't know that it would be a huge step forward, but I mean the principal difference, I guess, with respect to a general purpose data transfer mode like PACTOR is that we have built-in forward error correction, not just error detection. So yes, that definitely could be done, and you probably could design a better system in some sense than PACTOR. But we've also noticed that coming up with a better mode doesn't necessarily mean people will use it right away. It has to be a lot better. There's a lot of inertia in the system, and people already have something running.
It's very expensive, and if we were getting modems that would be people with software instead of having to pay
Yeah.
$2,000 for a modem.
Yeah, well, you just heard about one way of doing that, obviously, with Direwolf. Yeah, right.
One more.
Good.
Our club is trying to track a gentleman that's coming back from NZ land sometime in April, and your call sign there from New Zealand caught my eye. If somebody wanted to put a bird on the boat, we might be able to arrange a mutual contact. He's down there tramping around right now, so it might be something to keep in mind. Also, there's one spot open if somebody wanted to sign on his crew.
Oh, okay.
The boat's about 30 feet long.
Sounds like fun.
All right.
Signed me up about 30 years ago, but I'm not
Thank you very much.
One question on gravity, please.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Down in Hanford, in southeast part of the state, a Nobel Prize was awarded last year. Could you speak to that and compare it maybe to yours?
I think that's one of the most important advances in physics in the last 100 years. And I'm proud of the fact that it was in an area that I contributed a lot to earlier. Interestingly, the work that I did in from late 1970s or early 1970s, actually, up until the honor from the Swedes in 1993, basically established that the gravitational radiation that was detected by the LIGO detector in Hanford and its twin over in Livingston, Louisiana, we basically established unequivocally that that kind of radiation does actually exist, because we could measure the rate at which energy was being lost from an orbiting star system, a pair of pulsars orbiting around each other, losing energy in the form of gravitational waves, and the energy loss rate is what we could measure so accurately, and that was precisely in agreement with Einstein's relativity theory. So the questions about, yeah, but whether this gravitational radiation that Einstein effectively predicted but thought would never be detected, does that truly exist? Because, you know, until we've done an experiment, well, all we can say is this theory is consistent with that radiation existing, but in the end, experiment has to answer the question whether it's true or not. Anyway, we showed that it is true, and that was part of the reason that LIGO, a big science project that required $500 million to get it going, was plausibly going to be successful. I think without the experiments that I did, it probably would not have been fundable by Congress or by the National Science Board. So, very exciting.
Thank you very much.